Hi, my name's Moonpie and I hope you're having a fantastic day. Today we're going to be taking a look at mills. Now mills are obviously a building that allow you to gather food. Now this building is especially relevant in treaty, where without this building you wouldn't realistically be able to obtain enough food in the late game. Now there's been an ongoing discussion surrounding the number of villages that you actually should have on a mill. So I thought I'd run some calculations and reach my own conclusion. Before we take a look at some of the calculations that I've undertaken, why would you even consider putting less than 10 villages on a mill? Now, mills have a base gather rate of 0.67 food per second. Additionally, up to 10 villages can gather from one mill. Now, something that's unique about the mill is that a villager never gathers in only one spot, where routinely after a random amount of time, the villager will move from their current position to a new position. For example, as shown in the graphic, the villager is moving from point A to point B. When the villager is moving, they are obviously not gathering food. So the faster they get to their destination, the sooner they'll be gathering food again. Now with up to 10 villagers on a mill, and all of them constantly moving around, you will typically see villagers bumping into each other. Now it's hypothesized that this bumping, which obviously prolongs the time it takes the villager to get from A to B, has a significant enough impact to warrant reducing the number of villagers on a mill from 10 to 7. But is that actually the case? We'll now take a look at a couple of tests I undertook to determine if reducing the number of villages from 10 to 7 or to some other number is warranted at all. In order to test the various numbers of
Hola,
villages and
granja.
their gather rates, I used the scenario editor. I placed down a mill and then the number of villages I wanted, loaded the scenario, and then placed the villages on the mill. Now, in order to get a quote unquote accurate amount of resources gathered in 1 minute, I didn't count the first 10 seconds. This is because I wanted the minute's worth of results to mimic the villagers having been on the mill previously. Or when I first loaded into the scenario, they're obviously not on the mill. So I want to make sure they're set up and pathed correctly for the entire minute. In this particular case, after 10 seconds, 26 food had been gathered. This will be subtracted from the overall amount. Now after 1 minute, the settlers had gathered 223 food. Minus the 26 equals 197 food gathered over 1 minute. Now divide this by the 7 villages, and this means that each villager gathered 28.14 food in 1 minute. Now divide this amount by 60, and that means that each villager gathered 0.469 food per second, which obviously pales in comparison to the base value of 0.67. Now, I guess the real question we're trying to answer here is, does this value of 0.469 change a great deal depending on the number of villagers on the mill? So let's take a look. Now, as can be seen on the screen, I've recorded all of the testing that I've undertaken. Now, rather than bore you with an Excel document, I'll instead throw some graphics on the screen that highlight some of the interesting points that were established. Now, in order to maintain a reasonable sample size, I undertook 10 tests for each of the individual village accounts. Now, I first started with the 10 villages. Now, obviously, each of these tests resulted in a unique value that represented the food gather rate per second, but I'll be specifically talking about the averages of all of the test cases combined. So for the first 10 tests that I undertook for the 10 villages, this resulted in an average value of 0.48167. This basically means that through the 10 tests that were undertaken, the average food gather rate per second was 0.48. Now, the main topic of discussion here is between 10 and 7 villages, but I also included 9, 8, 5, 3, and 1 villager test cases as well. Now, after completing the test cases for the 10 villages, I undertook testing for the 9 villages, and I expected the mean value to increase, but that wasn't what happened. The average gather rate for both 9 and 8 villages was actually lower than that of 10 villages, my faith was somewhat restored by the testing I undertook for the 7 villages, which resulted in a value of 0.48667, which is a very slight increase in the average gather rate. Additionally, the gather rate for the 5 villages was also higher than that of the 10 villages. However, it was lower than that of the 7 villages, which didn't really make sense. This leaves the 3 villages and 1 villages. Now, the 3 villages was the only testing result that actually had a value of greater than 0.5 with 0.505. But interestingly, the 1 villager test resulted in a value of 0.481667. Now, with 1 villager on a mill, this obviously means that they're not going to be bumping into any villagers. So you'd expect the 1 villager to be a highest, based on the original hypothesis of villagers bumping into villagers, causing a reduction in the amount of food gathered per second. But based on the testing that has been undertaken here, that is not the case. When undertaking testing with the 1 villager, they had both the highest gather rate of 0.55 and the lowest gather rate of 0.4 in all of the testing undertaken with every single number of villagers. Now, this to me indicates that the differences in the gather rates are caused by the distance that the villager travels from A to B. Now, because this value is randomized, a villager could go right next to them, or they could go from one side of the mill to the other side of the mill. And this is what has been represented, especially in the 1 villager testing, where the 0.4 test result obviously occurred when the villager spent a lot of time moving from one side of the mill to the other side, where on the other hand, the 0.55 result was achieved when the villager was not moving a great deal at all. I undertook an additional 20 sets of test data for both the 10 and the 7 villager counts, and whilst the data pointed slightly towards an increased gather rate for the 7 villages over the 10 villages, I don't necessarily believe this is because of an increase or a decrease in the amount of bumping that is occurring between villages. But let's play devil's advocate for just a second. So the overall average for 30 tests with 10 villages resulted in an average of 0.471, while for 7 villages this was 0.482. This represents a difference of 0.011 food per second per villager. This means that for 40 villages, you'll be looking at a difference of 0.44 food per second. This translates to about 26.4 food per minute, which means every 10 minutes will be a difference of 264 food. Basically, for a normal treaty, at the time the treaty ends, this will result in an extra 528 food. Now, with 40 villages, you'll typically need 4 mills if you're putting 10 villages onto each mill. However, if you're doing 7 villages per mill, that means you're going to need 6 mills, which means you're going to have to build an extra 2 mills, which obviously costs 800 wood. And I guess the impact of having to build an extra 2 mills is twofold. Firstly, it's obviously taking up more space in your base, which means you have less space for walls. And then secondly, depending on the strategy you're using and the civ you're playing, this will have a flow-on effect to your strategy, where you obviously don't have as much wood, which again may not be as relevant depending on your strategy. But I'd like to point out, however, that I do not believe this difference in food at 40 minutes is caused by bumping. I believe it's instead caused by the RNG of distance chosen by the bills. Additionally, I feel with a larger sample size, the average for each of the unique village accounts will be closer, to the extent that it will disprove the fact that bumping has a significant enough impact on the gather rate of food to warrant reducing the number of villagers on a mill. In conclusion, as I've stated multiple times in this video, I don't believe the bumping of villagers correlates with a significant reduction in the food gather rate over time. This is especially highlighted in the 1 villager test results, which had a lower gather rate of both the 5 and the 7 villager tests. This indicates that even though this villager has nothing to bump into, they still have a lower gather rate. From my perspective, this indicates that the RNG that determines how far a villager travels from point A to point B when on the mill is the real difference when determining the differences in average food gather rates. And that with a bigger data set, all of these numbers would become increasingly close. So in my opinion, feel free to put 10 villagers on mills. Now, I've not actually undertaken testing for estates, but I assume they function in a similar way. But whatever the case, that's the end of the video. I hope you've learned a thing or two because I definitely have. If you'd like to review the data that I recorded whilst undertaking the tests, I'll put a link to it in the description. And if you'd like to discuss this further, feel free to put a comment below or come and check me out on Twitch, which is also in the description. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day/night, and I'll catch you again another time. Bye.